Well, everyone, it's time for us to talk about another iPad mini that came out a few years ago, and I will definitely tell you, this was one of those stopgap iPads that Apple made, basically because we didn't get a successor to this iPad until several years later. This thing held the iPad mini lineup up probably for way longer than it probably should have. It's still supported, which is nice, but I will tell you, because of the iPad mini 5 and the iPad mini 6, it really doesn't make any sense to purchase this iPad anymore, and that's kind of like the spoiler for this whole entire video. It's not really worth it, if you're trying to use it as an everyday iPad, but if you're using it as I guess just looking at, if you're trying to just watch a video on it, or as a, kind of like a stationary thing, you're not really using it for anything crazy, then I think it's okay. You can use the first iPad for things like that, but if you're trying to actively use this iPad, it really wouldn't be the first choice, and definitely with the newer improvements with iPadOS and everything, it's really only made this iPad feel slower and slower. So I'll talk about that throughout the video. If you want to pick up some iPads I will recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now on the outside of the iPad mini 4, we do have a pretty good 7.9-inch IPS panel. The resolution is very high, and it's a really good looking panel. I think ever since even the iPad 1, Apple made some really good looking panels on their devices, and this one is no exception. It looks very good, and I would definitely say if you're somebody who wants to go ahead and just, get an iPad display, it really doesn't get too much better than this from the iPad mini lineup. Obviously the new ones have less bezel, and you have 120 Hz on the newest iPad Pros, but this is still a very good looking panel for sure. You have the bezel on the top and bottom, which is quite dated nowadays, but you have Touch ID, which is something I really do like, but the iPad mini still has Touch ID in the power button, so definitely keep that in mind. I would say on the front, it's definitely a little bit dated, but it doesn't look ugly. You have a lightning port at the bottom, you still have a headphone jack, which is really cool, and on the back you have the aluminum back, which in my opinion still looks very, very good. I don't really have too much to complain about with the body, but as I mentioned, it is a little bit of a dated design. When you're getting an iPad like this, it really doesn't look that brand new anymore. It still feels premium, it still looks premium, but it definitely doesn't look as good as it used to probably back in the day. Now we have that single camera setup on the back as well, which is really cool. So you have, a front camera and a back camera. You have a great build quality. You have, the power button on the home button on the front with Touch ID. It's not a bad looking iPad, but again, it is a little bit dated compared to iPads nowadays. Now hitting on the camera, we have that 8 megapixel standard lens on the back, and we have a 1.2 megapixel standard lens on the front. Now the best way to explain this iPad's camera is that it came out in 2015, about the same time the iPhone 6s came out, but it has the same camera as the iPhone 6. Now the iPhone 6 camera really wasn't that great, especially, nowadays, so the iPad mini 4 is no exception. The camera on this thing really isn't that, amazing. It's definitely not one of its best features, and with something like the iPad mini 4, you're stuck in a situation where you can't do, 4K on the front or the back, which I think is okay, but compared to the, iPads we have nowadays, like the iPad Pros, and even compared to our iPhones nowadays, they have much better sensors than, these iPads have. So there wouldn't really be any point of buying an iPad mini 4 with the camera in mind when your phone, if you have an iPhone 6s or newer, it has a better camera than this thing. So that's probably the best way to kind of sum it up. You still have things like video mode, and I will say having an iPad with a camera on it is actually really nice. You can just go ahead and just, if you're getting a FaceTime call or something, you can just go ahead and pick up the FaceTime call here. And I think those are really cool things. But unfortunately, with something like the iPad mini 4, you are kind of stuck in a situation where it really isn't that, up to date with the camera setup. So I would probably recommend just, avoiding buying this iPad in general, but especially because of this camera, it really isn't doing it any justice, and it is quite outdated when it comes down to it. So in terms of the camera setup, that kind of covers it up there. But in terms of the software, this is one of the more perplexing parts of this iPad. Because this thing came out in 2015, you would think that, oh yeah, it's the 6S, it's going to last as long as a 6S, so it's expected. But this thing had the same chipset as the iPhone 6, which does not make any sense to me how Apple didn't support the iPhone 6, although this iPad literally had the same exact chipset. It didn't have like the iPad Air 2 chipset where it was like an A8X. This thing had that Apple A8 chip inside. So because of that, a lot of people were mad that the iPhone 6 wasn't getting the next versions of software, but I will tell you, I'm kind of glad that it didn't, because this iPad, although it's still supported with software, it really isn't, as great of a software version as some of you may even expect it to be. On iPadOS 15 right now, even with iPadOS 14 last year, I noticed this thing, sluggishly kind of slowing down, which, was I wasn't expecting it to be as slow and as choppy as it was, but I forgot that this thing wasn't matching the iPhone 6s. It was matching the, iPhone 6. So because of that, you're again in a situation where something like the iPhone, 6 isn't really going to be performing that well anymore, and the iPad mini 4 really doesn't perform too well with, iPadOS software that much anymore. I'm still glad it's supported. I'm still glad it's going to continue to get support for probably the remainder of this summer, but come into September, this thing is not going to be getting iPadOS 16 based on the rumors that we've seen. Again, we could be totally wrong. That doesn't mean it's going to 100% be the case, but I do think as of right now, the iPad mini 4 is probably not going to be lasting too much longer, and that's probably another reason why I would avoid buying this thing. Although, again, it's still supported right now, I wouldn't recommend buying it in the long term, and you're probably better off just, buying something else than buying the specific iPad. So that covers it up in the software standpoint, but in the performance standpoint, like I mentioned, Apple A8 chip inside, but this is where the difference was. This iPad had 2 gigabytes of RAM versus the iPhone 6 that had 1 gigabyte of RAM. So I think that's another big differentiating factor, twice the amount of RAM on this one. So it was like the same amount of RAM as the 6S and 6S Plus, which were the new iPhones at that time, but it had the same chipset as the iPhone 6. So because of that, this phone's performance matched the iPhone 6, but it had the same RAM as the iPhone 6S. Now I will tell you, the apps and the games and the application that you're going to use on this thing, once you are loaded into them, it's not really as bad of an experience as you would expect from about a 7-year-old tablet. But the problem with it is maneuvering through the whole entire UI. Things seem very, very slow on this iPad whenever you're actually, maneuvering around the whole entire UI. And if you're going through and like opening a bunch of applications and you're split screen multitasking and doing all sorts of those kind of things, you're going to be getting a much different experience than you may have expected before. And that is another, somewhat issue when you're buying this type of iPad. I would, again, hate for you to go ahead and buy this iPad, expect it to be, a way better experience than it was, and then you kind of being let down. So I think in this type of situation, you are much, much better off probably getting something like even like an iPad mini 5 that's going to be much better than this thing. Even an iPad Air 3, those type of iPads are going to be giving you better performance overall. But with the iPad mini 4, I say, it's a good iPad once the apps are loaded, but for everything else, for its age and everything considered, it really isn't that great of a performing iPad anymore. And that's probably the easiest way to go and, say it. I think a couple of years ago on iPadOS 12, maybe even iPadOS 13, it was a much better experience. I don't necessarily think it's that good of an experience anymore. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 5,124 mAh battery, and again, decent sized battery to have on this iPad mini. Since then, iPad batteries have been going up and up, which is really nice just in general. So this thing had a kind of a smaller size battery, I would say, at that time, but again, it was, a good size battery. And again, with iPadOS 15, these batteries have been going down like crazy as well. And that's kind of another thing to keep in mind too. So I will definitely tell you to kind of sum up this whole video, I probably would not recommend buying an iPad mini 4 anymore. It just doesn't really make any sense at all in my opinion. I would much rather recommend buying something even like an iPad mini 5, although it's only one generation newer. There were many years in between these two devices, and that is probably the lowest iPad mini I would recommend buying. If you can get a little bit, of a bigger device, getting like the iPad Pro 3rd generation would be amazing. It's definitely much more expensive and it's much bigger, but that is still an iPad that I use sometimes, and it is a very good performing iPad. It came out, 3 years after this thing, so it's a used iPad and still an older iPad today. You can even get like an iPad Air 3 or really any other iPad than this thing that's newer. You're going to be giving yourself a much better experience for sure. So that kind of covers it. If you have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.